Welcome, friends, to a face-to-face webinar. Face-to-face webinars are trying to offer a meaningful conversation platform where we are addressing the current issues from a leadership perspective grounded in faith. Our theme today is Following Jesus in a Rapidly Changing World. We're trying to give a leadership perspective. Our international group of panelists and moderators today, all of them followers of Jesus, include John Hart from Maryland. He's a co-founder of a policy advocacy group, C3 Solutions, which stands for Conservative Coalition for Climate Solutions. And he's also an award-winning writer and journalist and political commentator. Jill Hall-Smith. She is professor at United Theological Seminary in Dayton, Ohio. Then we have Camila Bocaniala, a Norwegian from Cluj-Napoca in Romania. She is a social activist, artist, co-founder of Polylogos Association, which is an organization focused on investing in a new generation of leaders. Then we welcome Susan Kerr from Luxembourg. She's an expert in European public affairs, and she's also the editor of the book, recently published, Is God a Populist? Then we welcome Heather Staff from London, from the UK. She's a political advisor on refugee and migration policy to the UK parliamentarians. Then we welcome Liviu Bocaniala from Cluj-Napoca, from Romania. He's an artist and activist, co-founder with his wife Camila of the Polylogos Association, which is an organization focused on investing in a new generation of leaders. Liviu will serve today as a co-moderator together with me. And I'm Tihomir Kukolja, the editor of Face-to-Face Webinars or Conversations, a former director of ROM, initiative known as ROM, or Renewing Our Minds. Let me share a disclaimer. All opinions shared during the next 90 minutes are the views and opinions of the panelists and not necessarily of the organizations they work for or are associated with. And now, a few words about the content of this webinar. Today, in a rapidly changing world, being a Christian means many things to many people. Things are being said and done in the name of a Christian faith that radically oppose and contradict each other. It becomes even more controversial when leaders, public servants, and influential religious leaders, who profess a Christian faith disagree over the crucial issues that mean life or death, or freedom, or oppression. It is not possible that everything that comes in the name of Jesus truthfully represents a genuine faith in Jesus and the values of his kingdom. In the famous second inaugural address, President Abraham Lincoln said, "Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any man should dare ask just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of others men's face." The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. And Jesus said likewise, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven." We, followers of Jesus, regardless of our political or ideological persuasion, are accountable for our words, deeds, actions, example we give, especially if we are in leadership positions of any kind. So this is guiding us to the overarching question of this conversation. What are the characteristics, fruits, features, values, or principles that make leaders, followers of Jesus, stand out as the light and salt to to our communities, to our constituencies, to the world around us in rapidly changing times? Or to say the same thing somewhat differently, what does it look like to be the leaders whose lives and service demonstrate that they are informed by their faith in Jesus? Today, this is an international conversation, but let us begin with the situation here at home in the USA. I would like to begin with you, John. And I would like to ask you, what is your assessment of the current situation in the USA? Are politics and ideology becoming America's national religion? Welcome, John.
Timur, thank you so much. And it's really an honor to be with you and all the panelists and the guests. I appreciate the invitation very much. And to give, and I'll spend a few minutes on Timur's question, but just to give you some additional background, I've spent more than 20 years working in the political arena, both directly as a senior aide to Senator Tom Coburn, Senator Jim DeMint. I also work with a number of organizations. Timur mentioned one, but I've been engaged in public policy issues ranging from the debt to healthcare, to energy, to the environment. And during that time, I spent 6 months actually in Southeast Europe after the war in Yugoslavia. So that's how I got to know Timur and got involved in the Renewing Our Minds project. And so one of my jokes, which is both a joke but also serious commentary, is we need to re-import democracy. In other words, we need to take all the democratic ideas and values we've preached overseas and reapply them in the American context. Because to get to Timur's questions, we're in a very polarized and divided time. And let me start with the conclusion, and then I'll fill that in and explain it, and then recommend just a couple of practical things that I try to do in my own life to be a follower of Christ in this changing time. And I think the conclusion is that in this divided era, we're bowing to the same false god from opposite sides of the altar. So in other words, the left and the right have both made an idol of the idea of politics and ideology. And as you think about how both sides communicate with each other, amongst themselves and about the other side, it's increasingly in almost in religious terms, where if you don't agree with one party, then you're evil, or if you disagree with the orthodoxy of one side and you question it, then you're a heretic, or you're a sellout, you're backslidden. There's evangelical terminology that's used to describe, impure conservatives if you don't buy into every element of what the party agenda would be. And the left I would say is becoming increasingly illiberal, where there's cancel culture, there's a lack of tolerance of free speech. And so at a time when we think both of these are polarized and they're opposite, and there are genuine differences, I would suggest part of what they have in common is that both sides have an idolatry problem. And that is a way, I think, of thinking about the world, making sense of it, that's helpful for us as believers. And this is not a new thought. Back in the 17th century, Blaise Pascal, the famous philosopher, said, we have a God-shaped vacuum. And that's a summary of this brilliant observation he made. He talked about, we have an infinite abyss that can only be filled with an infinite and immutable object. In other words, by God himself. And in the last century, Swiss psychologist Carl Jung, he was writing in the 1950s and 60s when the totalitarian regimes were coming to the world stage, North Korea, the Soviet Union. And there was a mantra that said, God is dead. These states would declare that God was dead. And Jung said, no, we all have a religious instinct, just in a similar way that Blaise Pascal talked about the God-shaped vacuum. We all have this instinct to worship something, to make sense of the world. And Carl Jung said to the communist regimes, you have not killed God, you've just replaced God with other gods. In other words, you've replaced God with the state. And he said the socialist dictatorships are religions. The state slavery is a form of worship. The policy of the state is exalted to a creed. The leader or party boss becomes a demagogue. And there's only one truth and there's no other, and it's sacrosanct and above criticism. And then anyone who thinks differently is a heretic. And so what Jung said about the regimes in the 60s, sadly, there's some commonality with what we see today, whether people
if they're pro-Trump, then they view people who are not 100% on their team as heretical, and vice versa. Unless you're constantly, incessantly criticizing Trump, then you're not a good Christian. Then you're not really with the program. And I think as believers, we have to be very skeptical of that language of certitude and that kind of idolatry perspective. Another thing that's fascinating is we've seen, and if anyone that's followed Pew Research has documented what they call the rise of the nuns. And I don't mean, Catholic nuns, I mean, N-O-N-E-S. In other words, the unaffiliated. So we've seen a rise in religious unaffiliation in the United States over the past 20 years. Now it's at least a quarter of the population. And at the same time, we've concurrently seen a rise in political polarization. So I would argue those two dynamics are connected. So again, it's not that we've become less religious, we're just religious about other things. It's not that we're post-Christian. Well, in other words, we may be post-Christian, but we're not post-religious. And another way to think of this is if you remember your physics classes from high school or college, Newton talked about the law of conservation of momentum. In other words, when an object crashes into another, that momentum doesn't disappear, it's just transferred. It goes somewhere else. It's called the conservation of momentum. So I think in a social science sense, we have what I call the law of conservation of religious instinct, where, again, it isn't that we're less religious. People think of themselves as very secular, very enlightened, very woke, very whatever, but we're just religious about different things. And I think as believers, we need to have our eyes wide open to that. And I think three ways that I've tried to navigate this, and just in my own life and working in politics, is I would say the first is to think about, identify who is the other. And for each of us, the other is going to look different depending on who our tribe is. In other words, if we want to work against tribalism, the answer usually is not to identify all the flaws and faults and quote the other tribe. It's to have the humility to think about what might be wrong with my tribe. Where might my side be missing the mark? And it requires an intentionality in order to see that, is to be in relationship with quote the other. And for me, some of my best friends are liberal Democrats. I've been meeting with a group of guys for over 20 years, and some are liberal Democrats. I'm a conservative Republican. I'm careful to say that because I disagree with a lot of what Republicans do and a lot of what conservatives do, but I'm, a constitutional conservative. But my identity is not in that, it's in who Jesus is. And that when we come together, that I'm accountable, as Timur said, for the words I use in public, for the things I push for, knowing that I have to look at someone who's on the other team in the eye, and gauge and measure my own words. And I think the other thing that comes to mind is the parable of the Good Samaritan. It's where Jesus very intentionally, he crossed the road to not just care for someone who was injured and in need, but to someone who was the other in his context, a Samaritan who was the cultural outcast. And the problem we have in American politics and just American life today is this culture of contempt, where we view the other side with so much vitriol, so much hatred. And the antidote to that is humility, and it's to love your enemies. I mean, that's the most countercultural thing we can do as believers, is to approach the other side with warm-heartedness and truth, with kindness. And I think that's how I view, to answer Timur's question, sort of the central challenge and what we need to do as believers, and would be happy to talk more and look forward to the other presentations and questions.
Thank you, John. I think you have touched a very important question, and I'm really looking forward to see what the other panelists are going to say, interact with this question. But there is no question that there is a lots of political persuasions actually being turned into religion and religiously followed in an unhealthy manners. I would now like to go to Jill. Jill, there has been lots of talking about the separation of church and state here in America, definitely. For many years, I believe that America had the best model of church and state separation, lately I became a little bit confused because this thing too seems to be attacked very much nowadays, as if this has not been a plan, original plan of America. So what would you want to say? What does a healthy separation of church and state look like? And then I would add also to this another very much linked question, and this is, how should one's Christian faith influence Christians, leaders in public life, in public arena? Jill, please.
Thanks, Homer. Really glad to go after John. We're part of different parties, but we agree on so many things. And that is actually true of the majority of America, believe it or not, and love that when followers of Jesus come together, we can hopefully at some point agree to major on the majors. I want to talk about how Christians can follow Jesus in their public lives. And this always thrown around this idea of the separation of church and state, different ways by different people and often without context, and is particularly relevant right now in contemporary debates going on. It's clear that when there is a governmental instituted church, it leads to the death of the church and doesn't respect the fact that we live in a plural society. But I also believe that that doesn't mean that people's values shouldn't influence their public lives. I wonder if evangelicals saw Trump as kind of a way to win the culture war, as there was a few years of perceived negatives, such as taking Christian prayer out of school or taking the 10 Commandments down from city halls, and that somehow we would be a so-called Christian nation again. In the US, though, we often reference the founding fathers' intention of the separation of church and state, who were, of course, influenced by Hobbes and Locke, who were British philosophers. And the intention of that original discussion was to keep the US from religious tyranny, which was a pressing problem at the time, particularly the church running the government or the government running the church, which is very different than the idea that somebody's sacredly held values would influence their social lives, whether those values are Christian or they're atheistic. I believe that for Christians to think faith should not influence their public lives would be a false separation of the sacred from the secular, the dualism that Jack Fallow talked about in our last webinar, or just the idea that Christianity is only for the prayer closet. Everyone brings their ethics to their civic life, which for Christians, I suggest, should be love of God and neighbor. However, there's this very selective interpretation of the separation of church and state that has significantly increased individualism to dangerous levels where the common good is barely a consideration right now. Speaking of evangelicals, much of the writing on the separation of church and state by the founding fathers actually concerned protecting the Christian faith from state institutionalization. Thomas Jefferson said, "I'm for freedom of religion and against all maneuvers to bring about a legal ascendancy of one sect over another." Christians desperately need to bring their values of love of neighbor to civic responsibilities, but we are also designed to respect pluralism, which is a society that allows for freedom of religion. And then everybody advocates for what's important to them in that context, which is democracy, and we find what we agree on for the common good. In contrast, on the far other side, secular humanists would say the separation of church and state should allow for no spiritual influence on public policies, but it's uncritical of its own particular worldview in those suggestions, as if atheistic worldview is somehow neutral and globally normative. In reality, there's really very few public policies that are completely value neutral. Secularism wants to remove religious motivations from public life, but also destroys pluralism by creating a new false universality, this sort of new religion of the state that John mentioned. So one example that I really think of a lot in kind of the selective way that evangelicals separate their faith from public life is the belief that government shouldn't help the poor. And I'd like to just talk about that example for a second. There's a very selective interpretation there where, there's many years of history behind this thought that thousands of years that assistance is a private matter of charity. a rigid separation between the roles of the church and the state, supporting economic theories of laissez-faire economy and trickle-down economics, which does in fact work well for very, very rich people, but often, unfortunately, at the expense of 90% of everybody else. White evangelicals in the United States have proved themselves powerful advocates in some areas. And there's measurements that this group of evangelicals is the most politically powerful group in the history of the world, that it has more power at this time than any other group ever has, for some reason often crying persecution. And with that political capital is advocating for private schooling, private healthcare, private charity over public assistance, individual punishment over social compassion. And the loudest public discourse sometimes comes in the form of calls to abandon the public good. What I find really interesting is that there are studies that show that those who attend church most often do not understand the mechanics of public justice or civic responsibility because of a widespread emphasis on self-enhancement and individualism. I think that theological centrality of evangelicalism in America is probably the source of all of our issues as a church. Not understanding the mechanics of public good is dangerous, as we see poignantly right now in the Christian perpetuation of very harmful conspiracy theories. And not understanding the mechanics of public good is harmful in that it seriously hurts the most vulnerable. In every case, the poorest nations in the world have little to no governance. Politics is directly related to poverty. It's indisputable that bad governance is related to poverty. For example, yesterday in Houston, there's 4-hour food lines. And I'm sure that there's something close to that in my own town of Dayton, Ohio. That is related to policies, because many of the people who are in those food lines, many of the people who are hungry right now are hard at work. They're working 9-to-5 jobs. And one wonders, where is the Protestant work ethic advocacy when people are working a full day's work but can't feed their children? The public issues that Scripture actually does emphasize considerably involves this intersection of care for the poor, economic justice, and civic responsibility. The church and state should hold each other accountable morally, which is the original intention of the separation of church and state, not that values don't influence public principles. We have this very powerful political influence in areas that we decide are important, but I suggest using that to hold the state accountable for fixing problems it's created with an economic infrastructure that creates unbelievable economic inequality. The global growth of poverty this year is from real policies and structures in societies, and is not just a spiritual notion that, we keep to the prayer closet. In the US, spirituality that is only for the prayer closet, when 84 million Americans are going hungry here, and there's 750 million people in the world that are hungry internationally, is no kind of real faith at all. Rather than promoting really disturbing QAnon conspiracy theories or negatively influencing democracy by attempting to negate election results or promoting anti-vaccine theories, I suggest a more fruitful public presence that addresses the numbers of individuals hard at work who are living hand to mouth, which has also slowed overall economic growth internationally, which is different than Christian nationalism. Or a church of the state, or on the far left side, just absolute secularism. The fact is that people can't tell us on either side how to think. We have to respect pluralism and come together in ways to create a developed society where people are able to flourish. It's important for believers to be educated in biblical priorities for public life, such as fair wages, care for widows and orphans, just immigration, rules for letting the earth rest, and are willing to critically examine scientifically verified economic and historic data in order that we can advocate for and vote for godly laws and programs that doesn't exploit the most vulnerable in society, which I believe is what being pro-life means. I wrote more about this, and I'm happy to provide the journal article that goes into more of the historic context of this debate. And that's all I have to say. So thanks so much. I can provide that document for free, obviously, for anybody who's interested in listening.
Thank you, Jill. There are a number of things that kind of resonates with me, but I'm just going to take one thing because I want to link it with our next presenter and speaker, with Camilla. You mentioned about something about evangelicals and persecution in some sense, wondering whether really it exists here in America. I wonder about this very often because many of them would like to give that impression. But when I listen to number of pastors and people who give themselves all kinds of attributes like prophets and bishops and I don't know what they are, especially nowadays, saying, I get an impression that actually they can do whatever they want, irresponsibly most of the time. And this is why I would like to ask you, Camilla, to address that question. Where have the shepherds, spiritual shepherds, gone? What can we say about today's modern day prophets and about the mega churches and evangelists who are really overdoing whatever they're saying and the way they're impacting their parishioners by statements that actually very often lead to hate rather than to acceptance? So, Camilla, you're welcome to share some of the thoughts about this question. Where have the spiritual shepherds gone today?
Thank you so much, Tiomir. And it's such an honor to be here. I am really impressed by all the speakers here today. John and Jill, I really loved your thoughts and your reflections. And I agree with a lot of it. And as I was working on this topic, I realized just how difficult it is to talk about. So I was really struggling actually with putting my thoughts in a way that would make sense even to myself, let alone to a whole bunch of other people. But here I go, I'm gonna give it a try. So I wanna start with actually this morning, because I was scrolling through my Facebook feed and I noticed there was an interesting discussion happening on the wall of one of my friends. And one of the comments on this post so perfectly exemplifies one of the key issues that I want to talk about. And I thought I would include it here. So basically, the commenter quotes the last section of 2 Chronicles 20:20. And this is about the US presidential election. So he takes this little snippet from this verse in the Bible and he says, "Have faith in his prophets and you will be successful." And so the commentator goes on to explain that because the Lord's prophets are claiming Trump will win, and the Lord often likes to make things very exciting, and he points to the example of David versus Goliath. And that's the end of that discussion. So I'm not going to be focusing on the US presidential election or even on politics in general, but I feel like evangelicals have done such a great job lately of mixing politics with religion that it would be almost impossible for me, as I talk about Christian faith and leadership, to avoid it altogether. And I think that's true for all of us. So this Facebook commenter that I just mentioned provides this perfect example of a trend that I find deeply concerning. And it's the rise of self-proclaimed prophets with a clear political agenda and the lack of accountability of our celebrity megachurch leaders. I'm not so ignorant to think that I know the whole truth, as it says in 1 Corinthians 13, 9-10, "For we know in part and we prophesy in part, but when the perfect comes, the partial passes away." We as humans are not capable of understanding the whole picture, the full and complete truth. Not yet. And it would be silly to claim such a thing. There was a time in my life when people were trying to teach me how to prophesy. And they would say, just close your eyes and listen. Trust that the first thing that comes into your mind is the word of God for you, and it is. I don't believe, actually, that prophesying is a skill we can be trained in. And I don't believe that any thought that pops into my head is the voice of God. But because of this kind of teaching, I think it's safe to assume that there are many people out there who are convinced that they are prophesying in the name of God, when in reality they're just sharing their humanly flawed and deeply subjective thoughts and opinions. In the last few months, my social media feed has been full of people claiming to know the will of God, specifically regarding the outcome of the US presidential election. Dreams were interpreted and reinterpreted. Words of knowledge were shared and reshared. Even after the election, when the outcome was clear, those who had claimed in the name of God that the current president would win kept holding on to this conviction. Instead of admitting their mistake, they would make up all kinds of stories, excuses, even lies, to convince everyone that they were right the whole time. Even to this day, large numbers of people refuse to accept the outcome of the election because God told them otherwise. And now I'm not going to discuss whether or not the outcome of the election is legitimate. You're entitled to your own opinion on that. But the fact that their argument is only that it was because God told them otherwise, I find that deeply disturbing. Because they somehow make it look like God is complicit in their mistake. And isn't that exactly what the third commandment is about? You shall not use God's name in vain. So this leads me to 2 Timothy 4:3-4, which warns us that a time will come when people will not put up with sound doctrine. Instead, to suit their own desires, they will gather around them a great number of teachers to say what their itching ears want to hear. They will turn their ears away from the truth and turn aside to myth. So it's troubling to me that it has become commonplace for church leaders to prophesy about or officially commit to the success of a certain political party or individual. Jesus is on our side, they say when they talk about their own political quest. And this kind of certainty on behalf of God is baffling to me. How do they know with such confidence that Jesus agrees with their political standing? And what has made them so convinced that God is suddenly party political? I personally cannot find anything in the Bible that would support this claim, and I doubt anyone else would either, but you're free to tell me if I'm wrong. What we do know is that God wants us to care for the orphans and the widows, as Jill said. We know he's against injustice, he's against poverty and oppression. We know he hates idolatry, wickedness, and lies. We certainly don't know if he would be a Republican or a Democrat. And to be honest, I really doubt he would align himself with any political party because he's perfect and our parties are not. So I'm not suggesting that church leaders are somehow elevated above politics and are completely neutral in their standpoint, because that's humanly impossible. We are political creatures. We are bound to have political preferences, one way or another. I think we should be honest about that. I also don't think it's fair to insist that church leaders should never admit what their political opinions are, or that they should never engage in political discussions. What is important is that church leaders acknowledge the spiritual responsibility and influence that they have, and that they understand how to use it with wisdom. And that would mean, for instance, that they don't use their official platform as church leaders to promote or defend a certain political party or candidate, even in their personal spheres. I mean, they do what they want in their personal spheres. It's their own, that's their own matter. But they carry a certain weight of responsibility due to their position. And we need leaders who are aware of and acknowledge this responsibility and who treat it with humbleness and respect. And we need communities that hold each other and our leaders accountable. So that's leads me actually to what you, Jill, said about individualism and how we're becoming more and more individualists in the church. Because one concern that I have is that in today's globalized world, when the mega churches are having an enormous influence in people's lives, while the local faith communities are suffering from a lack of committed churchgoers. So rather than going to our local church on Sundays, we can now simply cherry pick popular sermons and catchy worship music online, and maybe we read some recommended books. And there's nothing wrong with any of these actions in themselves, but if they replace our dedication to a community that will guide us and encourage us and hold us accountable, it becomes a problem. And without being embedded in community, we run the risk of becoming self-absorbed, lonely, and surface level in our efforts to follow Jesus. So I'm gonna soon round this up, but I think I just wanna make it clear that we need more than slogans and light shows and simple marketing, become a better you tips in this life. What we need is what many of us have lost, which is community and relationship and accountability and leaders who have integrity and humility and wisdom. After Jesus spoke to 5,000 people, he retreated to spend time with his closest group of friends. He let them ask questions without judgment. He bowed down to serve them in all humbleness. And when necessary, he corrected them, sometimes harshly, but always with love. And we cannot do any of this without community. Thanks to Jesus of Nazareth, we have an example to follow. As leaders, we should strive to serve the way he served, be a friend the way he was a friend, show character and stand firm in principles, but always with gentleness and care and love. And maybe by doing so, the world will eventually get to recognize that we are his disciples.
I've seen over the last several weeks, I've seen a number of those people or videos who are prophesying. And you know, there is only one thought in me that constantly comes and says, no, this is not my Christianity. This is not my Christianity. And I even placed it on Facebook a couple of times. This is not my Christianity. Because although I do not practice and I do not agree with them, I feel embarrassed. I feel embarrassed because I know that there is on the other side this cynical group that looks at any concept of faith with cynicism and disapproval. And they put us all in the same box. And they think you are just all just the same bunch of idiots, sorry to say this like this. And that's why I feel embarrassed, because I don't want to be seen like this, because I think that my faith is much more intelligent than that. And not to say how dangerous it is when those so-called prophets come with their prophecies and the impact they have on the minds of thousands or even millions of people. Negative potential outcome coming from those words. And even if some of them apologize tomorrow and said that they have wrongly understood the message from the Lord, the damage has been done. Thank you, Camilla. And this is leading me now to Susan. And in between, I just want to encourage you, friends, if you have a comment or a question, put it in the chat box. Susan, I think what Camilla was sharing with us kind of ties with what you would probably like to share. I'm specifically thinking about the last chapter of the book you have edited, and you have also been a group of authors of this book. The book, Is God a Populist? So you are speaking the last chapter about a measuring stick by which the leaders of faith, and I don't mean leaders of churches, but meaning in politics, public servants who declare themselves to be the people of faith. What is a measuring stick? And how is it relevant to the world we live in today? Please, Susan. Welcome.
Thank you, Tiamir. And as Camilla said, thank you so much for hosting this event. I think it is very timely, and I appreciate being invited to be here. Maybe before I go directly to the measuring stick, I should perhaps begin by saying, some of the questions that led to the book Is God a Populist were, what type of world do we live in? What are the political trends? How can we nurture positive politics? And, as was said before, with all of the fake news and conspiracy theories, it can be hard to understand what's really happening today or to know how to engage politically. And if we look to Christianity for answers, it doesn't tell people how to vote. It doesn't offer us a clear political roadmap. And, as Camilla said, some may claim it does, but it doesn't. So it's not surprising that Christians vote left, right, and centre, and that they might use their faith to justify views that are also determined by other factors. And if we hold views, these may change over time, or the parties we supported may undergo change. I'm sure you all know the maxim from the Greek philosopher Heraclitus that change is the only constant in life. Well, Europe has seen great change over the past years. If we just look at this year alone with COVID, all of the change that's come about. And as humans, as John said, we try to make sense of the change around us. And we ask ourselves, what does this change mean? Both for us, but also for the societies in which we live. And adding to the complexity of interpreting what's actually happening, we see things through human eyes. And as humans, we are imperfect. We may think that our partner is perfect. We might think that some social influencer looks perfect. But I can assure you, we all carry egos, interests, and perspectives with us. And as we'll probably see during the Q&A, of this Zoom call, I think there are at least as many perspectives as there are people on the call. And so there'll always be tensions in any human-made political system. And ultimately, though, we have to be able to live and work together with these different points of view and make that work. No human is an island. We have to live in community. As was said, we need community with others. And politics is one way that we do that. As human creatures, we are political animals, as was said. To deny this, though, would be to not fully live, or not fully live in the type of society that we want. Politics requires institutions that serve the pursuit of what is common, and politics should be a functional good. They should serve the structuring and maintenance of our common life in a way that fosters human flourishing. So I'll return now to the measuring stick you asked me about. We need to be able to critique our own and others' political views, and how do we do this? Well, we propose a measuring stick, not an exhaustive measuring stick, but some ideas. We're basically saying it's important for Christians to ask political questions, not falling into groupthink, not just thinking because something is labelled Christian, it's right for us to vote this way. And it can be less comfortable to think for ourselves, if we're honest. We risk disagreeing with family members, we risk disagreeing with friends. But what we advocate in the book is that we should think as Christians, we should think about how to vote in line with timeless Christian principles that have helped to shape the democracies that we live in. And three key principles we mention are the common good, human dignity, and the responsibility towards one's neighbour. We argue very simply that for Christians, political ideas should be transversely critiqued against these criteria. Now, people can and will reach different conclusions about how to apply these principles, because we're talking about principles, we're not talking about rules, but they're instructive all the same. For example, let's look at the common good. This is the idea that politics should be directed to the flourishing of a whole population rather than only a part of the population. It's a way of ensuring fairness. When political life only serves the common interest, or the interest of the few, I should say, or even of the many, but not all, it's corrupted into a form of majoritarianism. But failure to be subordinated to the common good puts politics directly into conflict with Jesus' teachings. As Erasmus said, he who allows oppression shares the crime. crimes of oppression fly in the face of the neighbour love that Jill mentioned, that Jesus noted to be part of the greatest commandment. In such scenarios, we often dehumanize others, seeing fellow citizens, as John said, as the other, who is less deserving of the same human flourishing that we would want for ourselves. So these principles can help to pinpoint injustice. They can also help to determine how coherent parties' policies are with Christian principles, and challenge us as Christians to come up with innovative solutions to complex problems where social problems exist and we don't like the solutions being offered to us. The measuring stick is, of course, to be seen in context of real-world phenomenon or factors. And in the book, we were looking at the rapid growth of anti-democratic nationalist populism. And this has somehow kind of arisen from a disengagement, I would say, in politics, amongst others. And the reason we felt it important to address Christianity is that there's been an increase of populist parties claiming to represent Christian values. And I, like Tiamir, I also feel very uncomfortable with this. Now, some populist movements can be positive. And here I'm referring to movements that say there's discrimination that needs to be addressed. And it's good that discrimination, that this is raised and dealt with. But when anti-democratic national populist movements claim to be Christian or to champion Christian values or causes, we have to ask, do they really do that? Now, of course, Christian identity means different things to different people. It can be personal identity, a belief, a sense of Christian heritage, or it can be a collective identity. Christianity isn't static, it evolves over time. And as it evolves, different people will seek to control the narratives about what Christianity actually is. So when Christianity is referenced by national populists, often the appeals aren't to a belief in God. They're often to a cultural Christianity, perhaps, and by that I mean an appeal to Christian roots, or Crusader-style Christianity. And this really advocates a return to a monocultural Christian Europe, a return, I say, to a Christian culture that never existed. We've never had that, but we seem to claim it does. It's sort of a mythical thing that they claim. Even amongst Christians, there are different types of Christian practices. Even in a very centralized church like the Catholic Church, we see different practices. Now, this monocultural vision cannot favor the common good because it advocates modern forms of racism or exclusion. Cass Muda, who's an expert on populism, he discusses this and he argues, as soon as the right-wing populists reach power, they practice what he calls an extreme form of majoritarian democracy in which minority rights can only exist as long as they have majority support. Now, this type of populism is, of course, opposed to liberal democracy as we know it here in Western Europe, where powers are separated and individual rights and freedoms are officially recognized and protected. National populist parties are by definition anti-pluralistic, and whilst they promise to recover democracy, they actually restrict it. Only one voice knows what the people wants, and that is their voice. Christians and non-Christians, we have to take this seriously. As Jürgen Moltmann wrote in the book, nationalist promises to place their people's interest first rely on at least one false premise. They encourage us to overlook the fact that we're not just nationals, we are part of a humankind that shares a common earth. I think this could be what Paul meant when he said, Christian citizenship is in heaven. Anti-democratic populists also refuse the possibility of a common life with others. They narrow down what is common, our humanity, down to exclusionary visions of who is or who is not part of the people. This runs against politics as neighbour love, which helps to rebuild the conditions of flourishing as we consider what isn't working, who is losing out or excluded, and as we look together at how we can make things better for everyone. There's so much more I could say, but I think for time's sake, I'll stop here.
Thank you, Susan, very much. Thank you very much. There is one single thing I like to pick up, the things that kind of speak to me, although everything did speak to me. And you mentioned actually several things when you are talking about measuring stick, and you mentioned service, justice, care. You didn't use the word empathy, but it was there. It was there. These are only some of the measuring sticks. Sometimes, not sometimes, very often, people who are Christians, they're just concerned about certain abstract theological concepts, let me put it like this, and unless this is satisfied, then nothing else works. And we are forgetting about the widows, we are forgetting about refugees, we are forgetting about homeless, we are forgetting about those people who are in a desperate need, and we do not consider this as our priority. This does not become our measuring stick to think, okay, myself as a Christian, what is my responsibility to them? This morning, while I was preparing my thoughts for this webinar, at the same time, I was starting receiving messages from a person I know, and he was sharing, probably knowing that this webinar is coming, and he said a number of things. And he said, and by the way, I was also upset with some of you when you gave so much attention to refugees. And I was asking myself, my friend, I'm not sure if we are really following the same Jesus. I didn't say it, but that's what was I thinking, if you are questioning that. So that was my little association on what you were sharing, very important. And this leads me to Heather. Heather, we are trying to come now to a point of maybe give some solutions if we can, and some recommendation. So I would like to post this question to you that is actually the question of this webinar. So at the end of the day, what does it mean to be really followers of Jesus in a rapidly changing world? How to change the current predicament of our forgetfulness of what it really means to follow Jesus, to take him as an example. Is there a sign of hope? Heather, time is yours, please.
Thanks, Tihomir. And I think I had to move locations actually very quickly a moment ago, and it's quite fitting because I was going to talk about humility and dealing with crisis particularly, and right now I'm sitting, my flat overlooks a train track, so you'll probably hear screeching trains, my neighbour doing some kind of exercise upstairs, my internet cutting in and out, let's hope not, and various other things that are going on. So it's quite fitting. When we talk about predicament, it always depends, doesn't it? Do we actually believe that we are in a predicament? Do we believe that we've lost sight of who we are and what we should do? And I think all of our panelists so far have given a really good insight into that, and also a narrative. I love the fact that we picked up on things about, the center or the middle that John was talking about. I work as a political advisor, particularly on migration. And often in those dialogues around refugees and migration, you hear the most extreme voices, whether that be extreme to the right or very anti, or very, very much that everybody, open borders kind of philosophy. And it's very rare that you actually get the complex middle, or the people that are very sympathetic, or the person that just maybe wants to know who my neighbor is and has some very valid fears at the end of the day. Polling in the UK has often shown that actually most people are somewhere in the centre. There was some polling done by a think tank called British Future, and that very much looked at that middle, the soft middle as they called it, and the people that are just wanting to know their community. Community has come up a lot during this as well, and as has questioning, areas about where do we sit in terms of our faith and our values. What about the food banks that we have here right now? And in Britain, we have an astronomical growth in food bank usage, particularly during COVID. And that also led to things where charities were being shut down or told not to speak out. Don't mention why you need to have this. The same for asylum centres, and particularly there's a rule that has just come past in Greece where people that provide asylum are being told, don't talk about it. Don't tell people what the conditions are like, just say you're doing it. And maybe that's part of the predicament, what it looks like, what it sounds like, but please don't ask why. Don't ask the uncomfortable questions. Susan mentioned a lot about community, and I'm really pleased. There's somebody that I really respect and follow a lot on Twitter, who's a Bosnian political scientist who's now in America, and I never say his name well, so please do correct me later, but Yasmin Mijanovic, something like that, I'm going to go with it. He argues basically that what's happened at the moment is we backtracked on notions of citizenship and collective belonging. In fact, we've kind of replaced it with a notion of just the taxpayer or subjects, or even backtracked quite far to that notion of sovereignty in that sense. And he says that nation has almost become a shibboleth. It's become this idol that we've talked about as well. It's replaced maybe a lot of our values, and we've lost a notion of seeing people. I was walking down the street the other day, and this is not a story about whether we should pray for the homeless or feed the homeless or goodness knows what, but for me it caught me off guard. And I think again it speaks to that notion of predicament and hope. And as I walked past a guy who was outside my local supermarket, he sits there week in, week out, day in, day out, hungry and, you know, very friendly, always polite. And I walked past him, went to get my food, came out and saw some people praying for him very loudly, standing on the street, you know, hands in the air, really going for it. And the poor guy, I remember just walking past and I just caught his eye, and there was just a look in his eye which simply said, help. And I just, you know, being very British and quite introverted, was like, oh, just go walk past, you know, sorry, you know, I feel you, but I'm going to walk past. And I walked on, and then I just stopped, and I just felt, and it doesn't happen to me very often, but I felt a very clear go back, give him the fruit that you just bought that you won't eat anyway, so, you know, just go back and give it to him. And I had this internal battle, which was, I don't want to make a fuss. I don't want to intervene. I don't want to do, you know, it's COVID, it's very unsafe. All these things that were going through my head to try and excuse why I should interrupt this conversation. And then I remember thinking, my whole role is policy. I make policy. I tell my boss, who's a member of parliament, you know, to care, to consider, to be compassionate, to be just, to ask the why, and to also live out a practical action. But if I'm not doing this, who am I? Why am I in this role in the first place? So I went back and I sort of slipped underneath these very dramatic prayers and gave them the fruit. And the guy just, you know, he was massively thankful. And the woman next to me suddenly yelled very loudly, much to my horror, you know, see, you know, God provides. He's provided the food that you wanted. And it turned out he did really want some fruit. But the story in that is not, should we pray, should we not? It's a simple, where are our values? Are we stopping to see people? And I was really struck just about that. In my role, it's all about big picture, it's about strategy, and you can get lost for everything that we're doing. And as Christians, I think sometimes we can get lost. We can get lost in the debates about, am I good enough? Am I the right sort of evangelical? Am I voting the right way? We can get really lost when actually sometimes we're called to just stop, look and listen. Surely that is to come back to a place of seeing and feeling and having the empathy that Jill's talked about as well within that. I had a discussion with one of my bosses the other day about compassion, and she was saying, is compassion too nice? You know, what does it really mean? And I ended up basically quoting scripture and saying, but the Lord is gracious and compassionate. It's an active word, it's a doing word, it's a ferocious word. And compassion requires action, and it requires us seeing people. It requires sometimes moving away from perhaps where we wanted to be in our comfort zone to do something else. In our current predicament as well, I've been thinking about, you know, how do we calm a crisis? I've been starting to watch The Crown, so on Netflix, and there's a scene in there between the Labour leader at the time, Harold Wilson, and he's talking to Her Majesty the Queen, and she is in a bit of a dilemma about showing emotion or not showing emotion. What do we do in this situation? And he simply said to her, what we have to do as leaders, our job is surely to calm more crisis than we create. For me, it seems at the moment we're creating a lot more crisis than we're calming. There seems to be every day another crisis that we're making of our own mind, whether that, you know, for me personally, I would feel that might be a Brexit scenario, or whether that's an economic scenario, or whether that's simply ignoring the rule of law, whether that's ambition getting in the way to such an extent that we no longer have calm in a crisis, but we just have crisis upon crisis for more people to fix. We create enemies rather than drawing people to one another. And I want to ask a question there as well about changing that current predicament. To do that, surely we also have to test conviction. We can have conviction, but is it rooted in anything? Is it just a shifting sand? Where is our conviction based? I'm glad Camilla also brought in about prophecy, and I think we've talked about that in the sense we see and know in part. Again, where does it come from? Is it personal, or is it rooted in something more? Is it popular discourse, or is it humility and boldness, to quote the Archbishop of York? C.S. Lewis said, if anyone is a new creation in Christ, that it shouldn't simply be improvement, but also redemption. Improvement is wonderful, but does it actually get us anywhere? And is it the right type of improvement? Is it just a mask that we're putting on? Are we actually fighting for something that is worth fighting for? Do we actually care for those around us? It's Christmas at the moment, and I'm involved in a lot of carol services, and one of my favorite carols is O Holy Night. There is the third verse in that that has not often been sung in some churches, and it's quite a provocative verse in many ways. And it says, his law is love and his gospel is peace. Chains shall he break, for the slave is our brother, and in his name all oppression shall cease. And I love that line, his law is love and his gospel is peace. If we're to change anything, if we're to grow as leaders, maybe we need to remember that his law is love and his gospel really is peace. Do we only care about what we're against? Is it picking the easy target? Is it picking the refugee or the migrant for what I personally try to fight for in my political career? Is it picking an easy target that is different to us, a political adversary? There's a scene in the Band of Brothers, if anyone's watched it, and they're teaching soldiers to kill people. And there's this guy and he's shouting, he's like, you don't want to do it like that. You want to kill him. That's how we're taught in politics. You want to kill him. You want to take down your enemy and you want to win. But do we want to win at the expense of what is right? Do we want to win at the expense of what is good, the common good has been said, for one another, for community, for citizenship, for society? And as I draw to a real close, I want to move into, is there a sign of hope? Well, hope's difficult, isn't it? Because hope is expectation. Hope is what we trust in. Now, I'm a person of faith, so I believe our hope is in somebody we can trust. It's firm foundation. I'm also a Man United supporter. Now, I can hope every Saturday or Friday or whenever that they're actually going to win at home for once. Is it going to happen? I'm not so sure. But hope in the eternal is something very, very different. It comes in many shapes and forms. Often the great reformers never saw the fruit of what they hoped for. We look at a Wilberforce years and years ago, yet today we still fight for anti-slavery. We look at Martin King, we look at Nelson Mandela. We even in the UK, we had the great Quaker reformers. I'm not sure if it was a coincidence that they were all involved in chocolate, but they were, which I love. But they were the great reformers. They were the Fry family, the Elizabeth Frys. They were the Cadburys, the Terrys, who saw the poverty around them and the need, and didn't just say, okay, there's a problem. They made housing, whole villages where they could house workers. Or the Guinness family in Ireland, he said, okay, there is a problem with the water supply here. People are just drinking gin. We need to do something about this. So they created something. We'd say, no, people shouldn't just drink Guinness all day. But at the time, it was the thing that really, really helped. There was a practical application, a sign of hope, maybe, that still we fight for today. Still, we have the same situations. What is it you're longing for? What is it I am longing for? Hope is rooted in something deeper. What is it we hope for a leader to say? Does my nation give me that identity? Or is it a desire really for more than that, to raise community around us? We just need to look around. It doesn't always look or sound like we expect. It often comes from unexpected sources. It's never pretty. And it's not slick usually, but it is authentic and it's tested conviction. It's often understated and played out in simple acts, a change of policy perhaps, a discovery, or even just a smile, maybe an eye meeting an eye, a simple reach of a hand, or a humble concession on a policy, a disagreement, perhaps, John and I might disagree, rooted in respect, a nature of dignity, and a justice done on behalf of somebody. I really could go on. In my church service on Sunday, our speaker, Joe, gave a quote that I would like to share, and it simply said this. It said, "Hope still wins, but it is often has a tear-stained face. It has a vulnerable heart, and it has bloody fists because it keeps fighting. It has scraped knees because it keeps crawling forward, and it's sweaty. Hope is not necessarily pretty, but you always want hope on your side because hope fights for you. Hope will fight for the hardest part of your life. Now is the perfect time, I think, to be reminded that there is hope, not a false, misplaced, I-centered hope, not a hope that bears false witness or makes idols out of an unjust motive. But as a person of faith, I would argue it starts and surely ends with the Alpha and the Omega, Emmanuel, God with us. An unceasing, uncreated, everlasting hope found in Jesus. So Tihomir, what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus in a rapidly changing world? I think it means to speak out when needed, to hold on to truth and justice, and to ultimately, it means to keep speaking and trusting, to act and give hope to all, maybe, trusting in the true giver and foundation of our hope. And that's where I'd like to end.
We have been given lots of material to think about in the past, I think, an hour or so. I'm mindful about the time. I do want to keep us within 90 minutes that we have promised to you. So without any further ado, I will give it over to my friend and brother Liviu to lead us to about 20 minutes of conversation and discussion. And then we will come to the concluding part. So Liviu, please take over.
Thank you, Tihomir. What a great bunch of people. I'm inspired. If I was in military, I'd take a gun and start fighting. But I have my brain, I have my heart, and I have my words, the same as you. What an excellent way to fight in these days. Because the war that's going on, we cannot see. But we feel it. It's all over around us. I'll go back to John, and I want to ask you directly. We don't have too much time to waste, and I would love to spend this evening with a glass of wine and lots of stories with you guys. You are a conservative Republican. Jill is a Democrat. I will ask you, John, how do you keep focus as a follower of Jesus in when it comes to disagreement?
That's a great question. Yeah, no, I would say the answer is relationship and accountability. It's intentionally keeping relationships with people who are in the different political camp very fresh. And what that does is it creates accountability for me, where if I'm writing a speech for a politician, or if I'm working on a legislative program with a group of members, I know that I have to answer to my public conduct and my public words with very trusted friends who love Jesus as much as I do, who have not yet come to agree with all of my same positions on political economic questions. And so that's the main thing, is really that intentionality of relationship, where, because the danger again is, it isn't that we tend to think, oh, it's the other side that needs to be corrected. It's the other side. If they would only see the light, if they would only see how damaging their policies are to people in Baltimore, the poverty, on and on, then we delude ourselves into thinking we're on the right track. And so it's like, if you're driving a car, you've got to have rear view mirrors. You have to know, you have to be aware of your blind spots and have the humility to know you're not going to see everything, and have those relationships provide those checks and accountability.
Thank you very much, John. Jill, I'll turn to you. Again, I do not plan this. Of course, we want to hear so much from you, because it's rare to have you in this combination, and you guys were very fluent today. Thank you for what you said, Jill. I would like to ask you. You mentioned this transition that must take place from individualism to how do you say it? Community, being together, turning and focusing on community, on the other or the others. How it's very dangerous, especially in America, and that's why I ask you. How do you do this without looking basically and straightforward as a communist?
Yeah, that word is thrown around a lot these days. If you talk about anything that isn't just about individualism, it sort of shuts down the whole debate. Like I said last time, I'm very much a capitalist, but I'm really for the small businessman succeeding, which, involves multiple different policies allowing for equity. And, I think that this individualism theology, which is really like an egocentric individualism, it's not really, it also involves bootstrap individualism, has been something that's infiltrated our theology really since the Protestant Reformation. And it's hard to read that into the Gospels, but people do, and I really like what people were saying, that Jesus would not have been a Democrat or a Republican. And I think that is so true. But I do think that Scripture gives us some clues on priorities politically to influence our voting. When Jesus was talking to the Pharisees, he was talking about somebody with certain citizenship capital and a tax bracket capital, because they were part of an excluded tax status as religious leaders that involved 10% of the Roman population at the time, including Vestal virgins and the like. And he was speaking to their political position of power and wealth. And, we remove these social things from the gospel now. British theologian Christopher Wright said that if you would have said during Jesus' time, Jesus doesn't care about politics, does he? That it would have been baffling. That Jesus was killed for political reasons. And the gospel, another theologian, French theologian Jean-Paul Helt, said, the gospel without this very politically motivated crucifixion lacks real relevance to real people in the real world. And so the individualism, we get on these tangents of personal revelation and the like, without considering how we live our lives in community. And, even going back to original Republican social contract concept, where it just doesn't work. You can't live me first in a way that really creates common good. So I think that the Scripture has quite a bit to say on policy, actually.
I will turn to Susan. And I will say this: I grew up under communism. I was 16 years old when the so-called Romanian Revolution happened. But before that, as a child, for me, church meant going in the evening. My father would take me, and my mom would take my brother, but we would not walk together to church. We used to go to a small house church. And we did that because the secret police was watching us. So we were not supposed to be seen as many people entering in one apartment. More than that, we used to sing with half voice. We were not allowed to sing too much because the neighbors could be a spy, would turn against us. And because the meetings were taking place in the evening, we would have our windows covered. So probably I'm still a recovering oppressed Christian, if you want. I had to discover personally that I'm not a Christian, but I'm a follower of Jesus, and that changes everything. How do you see that from where you are? Where does do we live under capitalistic religion? As a follower of Christ, where does, for you in Luxembourg, where does capitalism end and religion begins?
I'm going to backtrack a little bit just into what you were saying. So I've worked for a long time in the area of freedom of religion or belief, and I've heard all sorts of stories from people from all over the world telling me very similar things to what you're saying, that they're not able to worship freely, that they face discrimination because they belong to a particular social group that claims to be Christian, or perhaps they are practicing Christians who face discrimination because they've chosen that path. And I think that sometimes we take that for granted in the West. We don't realize just how fortunate we are actually not to live under those conditions, that we can worship freely. And I think that these are freedoms that we shouldn't take for granted. And equally for other people in society who are minorities, who are facing discrimination at the moment. I think, for example, of the rise in hate crimes or hate speech towards Muslims or Jews, actually. For example, I think as Christians we have a duty to speak out and to defend their freedoms too. Now you ask about capitalism. I think maybe I'm going to respond something slightly differently. I'll say to democracy. I'd like to just maybe respond on democracy. And I know we could talk about the left and democracy as superstructure of capitalism, etc. I think though that that democracy and human rights are underpinned by some of these very principles that I mentioned before. Looking at the common good, looking at human dignity. In fact, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights starts with that, the mention of human dignity. And I think that the Christian principles that we should all hold dear as Christians, that underpin some of the thinking around democracy and human rights. And I think that that's something we shouldn't lose sight of. I'm not saying that democracy is perfect, and capitalism certainly isn't perfect. But I think we have to not lose sight of what it is offering us that isn't available in some other parts of the world.
Thank you, Susan. Of course, this is such a, we just dropped one drop of water in an ocean.
Big question.
Yes, and we're all aware of that. Again, we're on a marathon here because we also want to keep our word and not keep you for too long here. Mr. Staff from the audience sent a question that I'll take the freedom to ask and answer real quick. And he asks if is it better to be a persecuted church than a corrupted church? It's exactly what I said when the so-called Romanian revolution happened in 1999. We thought that freedom came upon us. That's why I even asked that question for Susan. And of course, it's so complicated to approach the question and the answer. But what we miss now, almost 30 years later, is exactly that Jesus that was feeding us spiritually at those times. It's definitely better to be a persecuted church than a corrupted one. I will say this, and I'll continue quickly. I've seen people transforming their lives after they came to teach us about cross, to teach us about the cross. Americans, British, Swedish, and a brilliant answer. One of my mentors, a poet, of course, He said, "You guys come to teach us about the cross. We live under the cross." The name of that guy was Traian Dors, one of the greatest Christian poets I know. So yes, I would say yes, Mr. Staff. I wanna move on to Camilla, and I would simply ask Camilla to think of one important characteristic that she thinks a leader should have today, 2021.
Well, there are a few. Obviously, I already mentioned a few that I see as probably the most important because they are so clearly exemplified in our greatest role model, Jesus, and they're equally relevant today as they were at that time. I think being humble is probably one of the most important, because if we become arrogant, we lose sight of how we don't know, how much we don't know yet. Like John said, we lose sight of our blind spots. And that's a very dangerous place to be for a leader, because as a leader, you lead people. And if you're not aware of your blind spots, you can lead them into disaster. And that's a very serious thing. For us as followers of Jesus, it's, like Tiomir said, people who have been given a lot, there's a lot of expectations on them as well. We are to be held accountable for our words and actions, and even more so if we are leading other people. So I would say humbleness is a huge one, coming together with being a servant leader, I think, and also knowing and discerning truth. So having wisdom, I think, is a great one, if I can add that as well.
Thank you very much, Camilla. Heather, I'm coming to you. One of your favorite subjects is dirty hands, clean heart. You have 1.5 minutes at the most to convince us that that is the way to go as a leader today. And when I say today, it's existential today.
Disclaimer, during a time of COVID, we probably shouldn't have dirty hands, but that's fine. The image still works. But I'd say dirty hands means being active. It means getting involved. It means sometimes we consider politics particularly dirty, or we consider the media dirty, for instance, or whatever that is. But if we're not involved, who is in that discourse? We can sit there, and often I've seen this in some churches where there's a lot of complaints. I remember a number of countries, they always say, my favorite pastime, I'm not political. And then you get in a conversation over a cup of coffee and you're there for 4 hours discussing whether that's bin collection to, how much they hate the president or the prime minister or Brexit, whatever it happens to be. Everybody is political. It's just a question of what that means to that person. Does it mean your neighborhood? Does it mean governance, which is different to politics? Does that mean the local school board? Does it mean being a magistrate? What does that look like for you to express that discussion around politics? Clean heart. Where is my values? We've had this whole seminar, this whole webinar on this essentially. Where are my values? Where is that based? Can I maintain a clean heart whilst working in something many people would call dirty? I think we can. I think as long as there is a good accountability, and John mentioned this specifically, I think, but in terms of having those people around you, and as a political advisor, I would say this is 100 times crucial. Have people around you that are not yes sayers, but also question you and also give you something back. Don't be everything to everyone. make sure you know what you're standing for as well on that. And I think that is the essence of having a clean heart with dirty, albeit cleanish hands during a COVID time, but getting involved. Because if we don't get involved, who is getting involved?
Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Liviu, for leading us through this important section of additional conversation. I'm looking at the time, and not because we could not hear more. I've been enjoying the entire webinar, I have to admit this. And we could go on, but we do want to respect the time of people because we said 90 minutes, and I think we have practically hit 90 minutes. So we are not going to have a special conclusion because I think that whatever you have shared within the last 20 minutes can practically serve that purpose of having a conclusion for this webinar. We had a very challenging question, very challenging title, Following Jesus in a Rapidly Changing World. Our purpose was not to bring theological discourse, to theologically explain what that means. We wanted to be more pragmatic. We wanted to speak from the platform of people who are in leadership and who claim that they are followers of Jesus. What should that practically mean in a practical, real setting that, as Heather likes to explain, having dirty hands, but having at the same time clean heart. Always clean heart, but because we work in a dirty environment, not that we deal with things in a dirty manner, but that we have to handle, we have to face the dirt that is around us. We cannot avoid this. We cannot. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, John. Thank you, Jill. Thank you, Camilla. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Heather again. And thank you, Liviu, for this wonderful webinar that we have had. And thank you, all of you participants, for being with us and for listening and commenting. I see a number of questions and comments are coming. And just follow us, because we will be, by the grace of the Lord, we will be doing more of these things in the coming year, because this is, I think, what we need at this time. So basically, that's what I'm going to say at the end. Thank you again, and may God bless all of you till we meet again soon. And tell the friends about this webinar. Very soon it will be on Facebook and on YouTube. Thank you again, and God bless you.